Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 22nd of May 2024. We're going to start with looking at this whole argument concerning the use of US weapons and indeed allied weapons into Russia, with the US supposedly putting pressure on Ukraine not to use both US and allied weapons to attack Russians in Russia, and the problems that this entails in terms of fighting asymmetrically with one hand tied behind their backs. It's just really frustrating. Now there's the argument is gathering momentum concerning this. So let's go back to listen to, I'm going to read to you what Zelensky has said. How is Ukraine able to defend itself if they're not allowed to strike inside Russia? Well, here we have him saying, and I'll read the subtitles. We want to use the weapons for defense. How do we respond when they strike our cities? Their ability to strike from a distance is such because they are stationed in the villages nearest to the border of Ukraine in Russia. They strike from there, knowing that we will not return fire, knowing that they are using civilian populations as cover because their weapons are located among the civilian population of the Russian Federation. And by the way, this is why there are so many strikes inside Belgorod, because they have these weapons positioned in and around Belgorod, the city. Anyway, he continues, but they proceed calmly, understanding that our partners do not give us permission, as you said. And here, when we talk about ATACMS or HIMARS, or we talk about artillery shells or relevant missiles, Storm Shadow, Scalp, etc. He continues, we do not have permission to strike the territory of the Russian Federation, their military locations, their headquarters, etc. It is the same for air defense. How do we protect ourselves from constant strikes from Russian territory? Up to 100 kilometers away from a point in Ukraine or the border of Ukraine, they hit with missiles from Russian territory. How can we protect ourselves? Absolutely bang on there. And that's the argument. And what this also shows is that it isn't just about giving strategic ambiguity or giving implicit allowance for Ukraine to use missiles in that way. So the idea that the Pentagon has said time and time again, we don't encourage Ukraine to use our weapons in this way. Some people are saying, well, and I've said this, well, actually, that gives you a bit of elbow room, a bit of leeway to actually use that, even though it's not encouraged. Hey, we've still used it that way. And that has been the case with hitting the oil refineries, although Ukraine has begun hitting those oil refineries again. This, however, shows that it's not just the case of strategic ambiguity or a little bit of elbow room, because he is indicating that they are explicitly not allowed to strike inside Russian territories. Jürgen Naudit here says the Ukrainians are asking for help. We are ready to sign all the documents that if a Russian missile is shot down in the territory of Ukraine, NATO will not bear responsibility if it falls and something explodes, Zelensky said on the request to Poland, the United States and other countries to destroy the missiles over the country. So this is a slightly different subject matter, where can NATO forces or allied forces strike down drones and missiles that are flying over Ukrainian territory if they are near to those countries. So near the Polish border, they had a Patriot system and it shoots down a missile. And then he said, look, we'll sign the paperwork that if that air defense missile shoots down a Russian missile or itself falls on a civilian area and kills some people, you won't be held responsible for that, which is, I think, a really important point, by the way. According to the president, everyone is afraid, though, of escalation. What else should Ukrainians do? Kiss Biden and Schultz's feet, says Naudit. But now we've got a bit of pressure being mounted. So, well, actually, let's go first to what the US have said. So the US has not changed its policy regarding Ukraine striking targets inside Russia. Quote, our policy hasn't changed. We are focused on providing Ukraine with capabilities that it needs to defend itself within its own sovereign territory, Pat Ryder has said, which I don't think is that's not good enough. So question, yesterday we heard from Secretary on his views about striking targets in Russia with American weapons, but can you explain why Ukrainians cannot use those capabilities to strike back and respond to those attacks that come from Russian territory? I mean, we know what the Pentagon doesn't support that, but what's the reasoning behind this approach? Ryder said, well, look, as the Secretary highlighted, our policy hasn't changed. We are focused on providing Ukraine with capabilities that it needs to defend itself within Ukrainian sovereign territory. And so, we understand that. We're going to continue to have those conversations with our Ukrainian partners as well as our international allies and partners when it comes to all the kinds of capabilities to include air defense that Ukraine needs to defend itself. So I'm just going to leave it there, which tells us nothing. He's been asked very clearly for the rationale, and General Ryder did not give the rationale. There is an interesting question here as who's to blame for this. So ultimately, the Biden administration. But there have been some people that possibly correctly have been saying, actually, this is just pretty bog standard American strategic doctrine. And this is the Department of Defense over time. And actually, when you look at the use of US weapons to do stuff like this and blah, 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 and you can go back to Vietnam and you can, et cetera, et cetera. So this, it might be a slightly more difficult hill to, or obstacle to overcome than just, say, getting rid of Jake Sullivan. So Jake Sullivan is a bit of the fall guy for this kind of anti-escalation thinking. My question is it actually a little bit more deep-seated than this? It's uncomfortable for the DOD. Is this a case of the DOD towing the party line for the Biden administration? Or is the Biden administration, or at least certain elements of the Biden administration, like Jake Sullivan, in that frame of thinking that the DOD might be in as well, that is from decades long, worrying about nuclear escalation from Russia? Then a question back is, Secretary also said that, or Lloyd Austin also said that aerial dynamic is a little bit different. So could you please clarify this commentary? Does this mean that restrictions do not apply to aerial defense in Ukraine? Basically, can strike targets that are in Russian territory or of those aerial defenses? In other words, can you aerially strike targets within Russia? General Ryder says, yeah. So, again, as our secretary highlighted, I'm not going to get into picking apart a bunch of different scenarios. Word salad. Again, the strategic intent here is enabling Ukraine to defend itself and defend its sovereign territory, which is exactly what you are saying they can't do. They can't defend themselves. How do you defend from something attacking? Like, if I have a fire that's raging just outside the boundaries of my house that is going to burn my house down, am I only just allowed to put up sandbags and spray my fence with water? Or do I try and put that fire out? Surely I need to try and put that fire out. That fire is raging. But if I'm only allowed to do things within my own borders that protect against that fire, like, what does protection mean? Protection against that fire is putting that freaking fire out, right? Is going outside of my borders to dampen down that fire so that my house doesn't burn down. Like, what is defense here if not defending against missiles that are inside Russia fired into Ukraine, or to shoot down the aircraft that are firing those missiles? That is a defensive move. This is frickin' war. Like, this is not good enough from Pat Ryder here. And where this comes from, I don't know. Whether, as in, I don't know if this is just general military strategy, but he's smashing. There's a sense that you get, and I am only reading the transcript, that he knows that this is BS. And so, if and when we have anything else to provide on that, we certainly will. But I'm just going to leave it there. So twice he said, I'm going to leave it there, when he's explicitly asked, no, can you give us a rationale? Blah, 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 blah. I'm just going to leave it there. Yeah, but can you give some clarity over here? Blah, 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 blah. I'm just going to leave it there. Yeah, but I've asked you not to leave it there. Like, just say no, I'm not going to tell you. La, 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 la. Uncomfortable question. I'm not going to answer it. Is it effectively what he's saying? And it's just not good enough. But the question is, is this a part of a more deep-seated anti-escalation doctrine from within American thought and military strategy that stretches back through the Cold War? And we know that actually they have been very cautious. Even we talk about Reagan republicanism quite a lot. Like Reagan wouldn't have done this, but apparently, and only from watching the Turning Point documentary series, but he was very afraid of nuclear war and very afraid of escalation. And so, yes, he's very strong in many ways, but actually there was still a really prominent anti-escalation rationale running through what the US was doing because nukes, right? You've got to be cautious because nukes. So Russia starts to exercise to simulate launch of tactical nuclear weapons. So at the time that this argument is raging, the Russians are flexing their nukes, right? This is going to worry the DOD, strategists, and the Biden administration. But again, I would argue this is just saber rattling. But so they're getting out their nukes, they're doing simulations, they're doing these training exercises. You've got Belarus, you've got Russia. At the same time, you have members of the Senate and congressmen and women who are worried about this posturing. Ukraine says Senate Foreign Relations Committee ranking member Jim Risch, who's a Republican from Idaho, says Ukraine must be allowed to defend itself, period. If that means striking a Russian bomber, launching missiles at Ukrainian civilians from Russian airspace, then Ukraine should be able to take that shot. Boom, absolutely yes. 100%. There's also this letter that I've mentioned from people that we'll look into in a second. But congressmen from both parties have called on Lloyd Austin to speed up the delivery of weapons to Ukraine and allow it to use American weapons on the territory of Russia. They propose to expand the training of Ukrainian pilots on F-16 fighter jets. So we need to be doing more. Or the US needs to be doing more. This is coming from US lawmakers. Colby Badwell reports US House Intelligence Chairman Mike Turner and 12 co-signers, so he's Republican, 12 co-signers, GOP and Democrats, have sent Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin a letter asking that the Biden administration lift the embargo on Ukraine using US weapons to strike strategic targets within Russian territory. They're also asking for additional Ukrainian pilots to be trained, as mentioned, on the F-16 in the US, and for expedited delivery of additional air defense resources, noting that Ukraine is asking for 7 more Patriot batteries. And here is the letter, or part of the letter, for that from these guys. Really important stuff, this. Just hugely important. I'm just going to go to a comment for what it's worth. Viggo Holmson, thank you, Viggo, saying this yesterday. I've commented on this many times before on this channel. We should not forget that Biden, in his tenure as president of the US, has had to adopt a role that is completely foreign to him, being a commander-in-chief during an active war where the US has vital strategic interests. During his time in the Senate, Biden led negotiations on disarmament, de-escalation, and non-proliferation, the exact opposite of what he has had to do in this conflict. Yes, he has succeeded in pulling together and strengthening the Western alliance, but his fears of escalation has led to somewhat of an impasse and imposes a heavy toll on Ukraine. The range and quantity of military assistance has been just enough to stop further Russian advances, but not enough to beat them back. Restrictions put on the use of the weapon platforms provided make it all but impossible for Ukraine to actually win the war. This scenario is perfect if the ultimate objective is to seriously degrade Russia's military to the point where they wouldn't be a serious threat to anyone for decades. This is what Lloyd Austin said himself back in April 2022, was it, even at the beginning, rather than April 2023. But he talked about degrading the Russian war capabilities, generationally. The flip side of that coin is that this strategy would also leave Ukraine in ruins, continuing to drip feed military aid to Ukraine and keeping restrictions on usage in place is what is prolonging this war. Providing immediate, massive, comprehensive and continuous assistance on all levels to Ukraine without any restrictions, however, will force Russia to retreat or go nuts. Of course, there are other geopolitical strategic concerns concurrently in other regions and the potential aftermath for Russia. Displaying fear and reticence when faced with a bully only emboldens him. Fighting with all you've got while your friends are having your back might usually cause him to back down and flee with his tail between his legs. And that is what's going on here? Now, the question for me, the interesting one, because I think it's really easy to say, oh, the freaking Biden administration, it's Biden's fault. And I think you can make that argument quite successfully, probably. He has been a dove for most of his life. But I also think there must be, it's not just him on his own. Okay, so there's Jake Sullivan. Okay, so where does his train of thought come from? Does that come out of a strategic landscape or landscape of military strategy from which he is ensconced, in which he's ensconced? Is that something that the DoD has also been fostering over time? Because when you then look at, say, the Trump administration, their kind of strength is in appeasing Putin, in forcing him to negotiation tables, rather than saying, let's go heavy on giving Ukraine more and more aid. So the options are like Biden or even more appeasement to Russia. So, we need to go the other way. Now, does this look hawkish? Does this look bellicose? But you've got Russia being the outright aggressors here, and you have to stand strong against those aggressors. And I think NATO needs to be strong. I think Europe needs to be strong, and I think the US needs to be really strong. But thinking it will be better given a Trump administration is going wrong. I seriously don't know how, and I know there are people in my comments who are Trump supporters, who are also Ukraine supporters. I don't know how you square that circle. For me, it's impossible. For me, you've got issues in your mind that you are so in the Trump camp that you would support him and think that he's going to do the right thing for Ukraine. He won't. He'll do the right thing for Trump and Trump only, and that is how he operates. So for me, the only option is convincing the Biden administration in the ways that we've seen with some bipartisan pressure, but also pressure from European allies and from Ukraine themselves to change this ruling. We've got certain European diplomats and politicians, Gabrielis Landsbergis and others who are being very clear on what the US should do to allow Ukraine the ability to fight without two hands tied behind their back. Now, this, of all the things I'm going to say today, this is the single most disturbing thing. Grant Shapps, UK's Defence Secretary, speaking at London Defence Conference, essentially accusing neutral countries of free riding. It's not this is, yeah, okay. Says he will make a case for all those European nations which benefit from coverage but aren't in the alliance to join NATO. So he's encouraging NATO expansion, saying there's a lot of nations that are just free riding on what NATO are doing. And I'd agree with that. Okay, that's all pretty standard fare. It's this that completely scares me, because I've said for a long time there's only one way that Russia wins this war or prevails in this war. What does that mean for Russia? There's only one way that really, really disables Ukrainian ability to win, and that is if China help Russia with lethal aid. If they help, helping them in the grey areas is bad enough, right? Dual use goods, helmets and drones and bulletproof vests and all that stuff is a problem, and components that can make military aid military equipment is a problem. But what Shapps has said here, this should be front page news, in my opinion. Shapps, in response to Mark Urban clarifying with a question, asking a clarifying question, says that new intelligence from British Defence Intelligence says, quote, lethal aid, end quote, is now flowing from China to Russia. It's a significant development. In the early days, China liked to present itself acting as a moderating influence. Sorry, that's the end quote. So lethal aid is now flowing from China to Russia. It's a significant development. In the early days, China liked to present itself acting as a moderating influence. This is bad news. He said earlier in the speech they are, quote, collaborating on equipment, then clarified that meant lethal aid. But I understand they're not going to say any more on what it is, says Shashank Joshi from The Economist, the defense correspondent. This is huge. So we are now properly getting into deeper into this world war. I've said that we're in a world war. And if China are much more formally on board with supporting Russia's military project with military aid, then we've got to wake up and smell the coffee. This is not the time to go, okay, then let's give up. This is the time to double down and say, right, China, we're going to put some big old sanctions on you. And interestingly, China have sanctioned US entities today. So we're starting to see an escalation there. Do we allow Russia and China to win? Do we back down and say, oh, sorry, didn't mean to annoy you, China? Or do we stand strong and do we support Ukraine as much as possible? I'm having a massive argument with someone on Twitter yesterday who is an American, who I know he's gone down a particular political pathway. And he's like, why should we be helping Ukraine? It's not in our interests. But then said we should be spending that money on Taiwan. As if like China aren't looking to how the US support Ukraine in terms of what they're going to do with Taiwan. As many analysts have said, the best money for supporting Taiwan is spent in supporting Ukraine. Just we are inching closer and closer towards a truly global conflict and a more open. I mean, it's already hybrid warfare. China are getting increasingly involved here, and this is a huge problem. Sweden have woken up and smelt the coffee. So the Swedish government has agreed to create a support framework for Ukraine, which would allocate 75 billion Swedish krona, so that's about $7 billion, in military support from 2024 to 2026. So that's about $2.5 billion, maybe a bit less than that, a year. So given the size of Sweden, that's good. And also it's the key here is 2024 to 2026. This is what Norway's done. It's what the EU has done. It's about giving long-term support that doesn't just allow for the tap to be turned off arbitrarily like later this year. So, oh, we're fed up now. Or November this year, maybe US elections, US doesn't support Ukraine anymore. This is obliging nations to help on a long-term basis to mitigate against political wins. And I think that's really, really important. So Paul Jonsson, who is the Swedish foreign minister, I think he's not the prime minister, is he? I'm pretty sure he's the defense minister, not foreign minister. Okay. Today, Sweden presents its 3-year plan for military aid to Ukraine. And this is really good. I've had Swedish people saying, God, I'm so pissed off with my own country not supporting as much as, say, Norway or Denmark or other nations. But actually, they've taken their time, maybe, and they just put this together. Together with the previous Swedish support packages, this will bring Sweden's total military aid to Ukraine to over 100 billion Swedish krona, which is 8.6 billion euros. And by the way, 6.5 billion euros is more, so that would be about $7 billion. The 3-year plan will stretch from 2024 to 2026, which means that roughly 2.1 billion euros will be allocated to Ukraine's military needs each year. However, the plan should not be seen as a ceiling for Sweden's military support for Ukraine. Key. So this is your baseline. We can do more if needs be. The plan does not mean that Swedish aid will end in 2026. If the situation should require, the government is ready to look into further support. The plan will cover all economic areas of Swedish military support to Ukraine. For example, donations of military aid and training of troops. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a threat to the entire democratic world. By providing a long-term plan for Sweden's military aid, we show that we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. It sends a clear message to Russia that time is not on its side. This is really, really good. This is a not insignificant amount of aid, given population, GDP, etc., etc. The Swedish government has ordered a new batch of CV9035s Mark III Cs infantry fighting vehicles from BAE Systems. So these are the BAE Systems Swedish infantry fighting vehicles. They already have some of these. I don't know if it's the latest variant, but they have some of these in Ukraine already, as well as associated integrated logistics support. So the new CV9035 Mark III C will replace the CV9040s, so they're the ones that the Ukraine has got, that were transferred to Ukraine. In addition, the Swedish government is buying more new CV90s to expand Ukraine's capabilities. So as well as sorting out their own military with these new ones, it seems like this is also to help Ukraine as well. At the same time, the European Commission has announced that Ukraine will receive the first payment from the excess profits from the use of frozen Russian assets in July. Now, I was expecting a decision to be made by July due to that being when, was it the G7 meeting? And they were tasked with getting together a package to then come to the G7 meetings to talk about this. But actually, it seems this is the EU, the European Commission. It seems like this has been expedited and has happened a lot more quickly, and so that they're going to get a payment within in July, and that's fantastic. In 2024, the EU will allocate all the funds received from Russian assets to the Ukraine facility, a 4-year program to provide economic assistance to Ukraine. During the year, it's planned to transfer about 2.5 to 3 billion euros, so that'll be over $3 billion under this mechanism. Excellent stuff there. And No Reports talks about this, and it's coming from the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Czech Republic, Jan Lipavsky. Up to 3 billion only this year. 90% goes for the Ukraine's military. Russia must pay for its war damages. Of course, 10% will go towards countries like Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, who say, yeah, we don't want it going to the military, so some of it will go to humanitarian support. The decision to transfer 7 Patriot systems to Ukraine may be made at the NATO summit in Washington in July. As Zelensky said in an interview with the New York Times, Ukraine needs 20 to 30 systems, Patriot systems, but it will agree to 7 to protect oblasts key to the national economy and energy sector. Where those are coming from, I don't know, and why the decision hasn't been made yet and how they're going to procure them, because surely they need to be ordering those from the manufacturers in order to either get them directly from the manufacturers or to backfill, or there will be already a waiting list with the manufacturers anyway. So, things need to happen sooner rather than later. Anton Geraschenko here talks about the ULEZ scheme. So just to let you know, Transport for London, in charge of the London transport infrastructure, which is incredibly complicated, involves gazillions of buses and metros and all sorts. So there's a lot of financial and organisational obligations there. They had this scheme under the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, to have a scrappage scheme in place to try and get emissions down in London because there's so much traffic. You get a bit of a kickback if you scrap an older engined vehicle, like a van, and you say, right, it's producing emissions. I'm gonna get rid of this and get either a much cleaner engine or an electric engine, and you will give me, say, £2,500 back. So you then scrap that vehicle. But originally, the legal obligations for ULEZ were to then properly scrap that vehicle, because obviously it has emissions and you're trying to get rid of those and then replace it with a clean one, rather than take that vehicle and then use it somewhere else. So there were legal restrictions that meant that when Ukraine asked for those scrapped vehicles to be scrapped, Sadiq Khan said, well, we can't really do that. And actually, he was technically correct, even though he got a lot of pushback from people who don't like him because he's a Labour politician, etc., etc. But he said, I'm fine with that if you can get the legal aspects changed. So he then deferred to the government who kind of were overseeing this, the Conservative government. They got that changed, and then this is now allowed for those scrapped vehicles to be sent to Ukraine, and now they're going there. So a while ago, I posted about this opportunity for Ukraine to get the vehicles. You asked for your help. Many of you were already working on making that happen. Many joined in. Result, 20 vehicles arrived to Ukraine over the weekend. More than 100 vehicles have been donated to Ukraine through the ULEZ program since it was permitted from the 15th of March, and around half of those 100 have been delivered already. British Ukrainian Aid, BU Aid, which is operating the scheme with Transport for London, said a further 13 vehicles were en route to Ukraine, and they would be used for medical and humanitarian purposes. By the way, Dan Smith, and who I've interviewed, and those working for Bristol, from Bristol with Love, and you guys helped to provide them with some funding way back when I interviewed them. They are going out, they might even be back already. I want to interview them about their experiences. They've gone out again to Ukraine, been waiting to collect all their stuff together before taking stuff out. So it's great that these movements are still working. And this is another one. They are en route. 13 vehicles are en route with medical and humanitarian purposes, vehicles for those purposes. So that's great stuff. To get older vans and whatnot sent out to Ukraine to help with transportation. We can see those lost lists from Andrew Perpetua every day, where you see a whole list of vans, loafs, SUVs and whatnot being blown up. they get used up, they get attrited, or they end up getting used so much they break down, so on. So they need a continuum supply of these kinds of vehicles. And so over 100 of these coming from Transport for London, I think, is a fantastic achievement. And it's really great that this was solved when there was an obstacle in place. A convoy of 20 vehicles donated is here saying arrived over the weekend, 30 more on the way. So it's really good news. Okay, German aid to Ukraine, in a sort of similar, well, not really, but another scheme from another country, this time Germany. It's just great that there are so many of these. And again, I always say, is this happening with Russia? How often do we see other countries get together and do this kind of thing? Well, we don't really. So this gives us an indication of who's on the right side. The moral evaluation of this conflict is fairly clear cut, even though some people argue that it isn't. Anyway, he said, German aid to Ukraine said, on Thursday, a fully loaded lorry with food, parcels, hygiene articles, refrigerators, washing machines, tablets, bicycles, and more set off for the southwestern city of Chernivtsi. The donations came from a joint campaign by the city of Düsseldorf and the German association Akzeptanz Vertrauen Perspektive, AVP, and the US non-profit organization United Help for Ukraine. Once in Chernivtsi, they will be distributed to the Magelsky Psychoneurological Orphanage, Center for Social and Psychological Rehabilitation of Children, and numerous foster families in Chernivtsi. So why I'm pointing this out is that these things happen quite frequently, but also it's worth noting the amount, because it's Dusseldorf that was mentioned here. It's interesting that the amount of time, the amount of cities that have been twinned with Ukrainian cities as a way to continue offering help to particular localized regions of or cities of Ukraine is really useful. So there are French cities, there are German cities, there will be cities in Poland and elsewhere around Europe that are twinned with particular places, and that allows those relationships to be made and aid convoys and humanitarian assistance to go out to those cities. Right, German aid to Ukraine says disappointing statement by the German Minister of Defense. So I talked about this yesterday. This is that there's $1 billion worth or euros worth of funding has been collected, or at least pledged, for the IAAD, which is a German air defense initiative. But not a single country, neither France, GB, Romania, or US, is contributing with air defense systems to that initiative. Germany is the only one doing that. Although Lithuania has pledged some radars towards that. So I guess it also answers the question, it says German aid to Ukraine, if Romania will deliver a Patriot battery to Ukraine as part of the German initiative to strengthen the Ukrainian air defense in the short term. So it's before thought that Romania might be contributing a Patriot system, but the defense minister wasn't up for that, and I talked about whether that might be on the cards. It appears it probably isn't on the cards, since Germany is saying we're the only ones doing that now, which means that Romania appears to have said no. So it's more likely they'll provide either money or missiles. If I recall correctly, so he said, okay, that answers the question about Romania sending that. If I recall correctly, that was also clear beforehand. If I remember the official statement correctly, a Patriot battery would have been sold and not donated. It therefore cannot be part of the initiative. At the end, I would like to point out that ammunition and the missiles are very much appreciated and needed in Ukraine, but the main goal of the German initiative was to provide Ukraine with more air defense systems, primarily with additional Patriot batteries. In my opinion, this is therefore a bit disappointing. So yeah, it is disappointing. Germany were the only country to actually front up the really important systems that they need, a further Patriot system. French aid to Ukraine having another thread on the Caesar. This is their kind of highlight, their big ticket item that they've assisted Ukraine with. Self-propelled gun. Quote, also demonstrated good level of robustness, especially when compared to automated tracked artillery systems supplied to Ukraine by other Western countries such as the Panzer 2000 and the M109, that one from the US. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has repeatedly expressed its full satisfaction with the Caesar artillery system used in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Thanks to its mobility, the Caesar is less vulnerable to enemy artillery fire than fixed guns. Equipped with an inertial unit for navigation and aiming, the Caesar does not require a permanent satellite link to fire its ammunition. However, as recognised by the Ministry of Armed Forces, the limit of Caesar delivered to Ukrainian armed forces is at its maintenance and operational condition level, MOC level, taking into account its frontline requirements. The intensive use of this system by the Ukrainian armed forces requires particularly efficient maintenance and leads the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense to regularly order the tools, spare parts and services necessary for its maintenance from Nexter. Of course, this is the same with all of those that are being given, bought, donated from European or American nations to Ukraine. To speed up the MOC, components of the Caesar will be manufactured on Ukrainian soil. According to Laurent Lanier, so he's an actualité, so defense and security news journalist, the officer at the origin of the Le Monde article where these opinions were coming from was disavowed by superiors a few days later, and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense had issued a press release praising the great efficiency and great combat precision of the Caesar. So I don't know what that pertains to, but the idea that there are these problematic logistics lines for items like the Caesar, like the Panzerhauser 2000, has led people like Rheinmetall and Nexter to look at setting up shop to some degree inside Ukraine to be able to better service these items so that they can be used consistently and reliably on the front lines. Finland is currently producing over 5 times more artillery shell bodies than before the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Such plans to expand production at Namo Lapura's Sastamala plant have been known since February, but they've evidently been already achieved in just a few months' time. This was disclosed by the Finnish Defence Minister Hakanen in this. I didn't know we were in June. Anyway, as in DUNE, not the month, in his meeting today with US Secretary of Defense Austin. So the Finnish are being really important here in producing ammunition, but also they are hoping to open another TNT plant, as I reported previously, which would be super useful because there is a bit of a bottleneck with regard to some of the components needed for these shells. As someone said, so it was 20,000 rounds per month pre-war, so now 100,000 rounds per month. Norway's pre-war, says Colby Badawar, was thought to be 20,000 per year. That's separate from Nammo across Norway, Sweden and Finland. So I don't know what it means they are producing per month or per year. This person says, Nammo Group stated that they plan to produce 200,000 155mm artillery shells a year by 2028. Ukrainians need minimum 2,000 shells a day. Russians fire 10,000 a day. European countries don't believe they will need to engage in a war. They ramp up production very slowly. This is true. But actually, if you add all these together with, of course, the US there's now at 28,000 a month and is planning on being, 75,000 a month? 80,000 a month, I think it is their plan by 2025. So that's like 1,000 a day are being produced by the US. Now, are they producing all of them for Ukraine? Doubtful. But let's assume you've got, considering it's likely to be higher than that now. I think it's 30,000 plus now. So that's 1,000 a day from the US, and all the other nations need to provide 1,000 a day. That's what they'll be doing. Then you've got the Czech initiative, the Estonian initiative. You've got ramping up all over the shop. So I think you are sustainably now at over 2,000 a day for Ukraine, which is what they're firing right now. And I think that's only going north of there. So I think the outlook is good for Ukraine. The question is, what is Russia able to do? Are Russia genuinely able to keep producing at the levels they are? Remember, they're down to 10,000 a day used. Now, they were at 40 to 60,000 at the peak of the war. So this is a quarter to a sixth of what they were at. And that is being sustained by huge numbers coming from North Korea. Is that a sustainable procurement? Are those shells good enough? Actually, there's a lot of talk about a lot of duds and inaccuracies and blowing up blowing up barrels, etc., etc. So I think when you look at the long-term prognosis here, I think Ukraine are in an increasingly better position, and Russia are in an increasingly troubling position. Will that ever get to a point where Ukraine are able to fire more than Russia? I don't know. But if they can continue to fire better shells more accurately than the Russians and use them more effectively, then they can overcome that ratio with a greater efficiency. Now, Defense Procurement Agency of the Ministry of Defense will purchase 4,200 DJI Mavic 3E drones with additional equipment, says the MOD. The total number of contracted drones is 8,200. The total amount of concluded contracts amounts to 1.1 billion hryvnias. So they are getting a lot of drones from China. They need those drones. They're really useful. They did have a problem with a whole bunch of them having their chips drilled through. So there was sabotage of those drones coming from China. That has been sorted out. In fact, Greg Terry and Zhenya have been involved in securing the replacement chips for those drones. Amazing stuff. The SPU, the Ukrainian intelligence, has a new weapon, Grad equipped Sea Baby drones. So I talked about this in the last video. SBU has revealed the latest update to its highly effective Sea Baby naval drones, which are now capable of launching salvos of it looks like 6 Grad rockets. A source in the agency told the Kyiv Independent. Indeed, we've seen a Russian video of this. There you see it. That's one there firing off the salvo of unguided rockets. So they are unguided. They're only going to be of limited use, considering you're going to have a Sea Baby bouncing up and down. These are going to be more for just barrages, and they're not even huge numbers of barrages. It depends how many of these drones you can have hammering a particular target. It's going to have a psychological component, but it will be limited in its effectiveness due to them being the types of rockets that they are, unguided rockets fired from the sea. Right, Justice Ministry says that over 3,000 Ukrainian convicts have applied to join the army. I did mention this yesterday. More than 3,000 convicts have applied for conditional release to join Ukraine's armed forces, according to Deputy Justice Minister Olena Vysotska. That was yesterday. This is really important. So 3,000 is going to super help. If they can get even more, obviously that would be brilliant. There was talk about 11,000 judicial cases having been stalled because of possible volunteering for the armed forces there. This is definitely something Ukraine need to do. They need to get boots on the ground, and preferably from here, if you can get over issues of cohesion, social cohesion with having convicts, as long as they're not like serious convicts. If you can get like white collar convicts fighting on the front line, etc., then this is a really good source of personnel, especially since these people. I don't know what the payment system is like for that, whether you could save money on paying them. You might not have to pay them the full wage, because this is something that conditions their release or their prison sentence or whatever. So I think there are probably a number of benefits to this that far outweigh the disadvantages. And this bit of footage is doing the rounds. This is a train with a whole lot of equipment, Russian equipment on it, seen in the Tula region of Russia, I presume on the way down to the Kharkiv front there. And in fact, it's got a new symbol on the front, which I think is the Kharkiv symbol, which is like a square, or kind of not a rhombus, but a square on it on a slightly different axis, and then an X through the square. So, what we can see there's a list of stuff, mainly support vehicles, but a couple of bits of artillery and a tank, and a couple of MTLBs, but essentially mainly support equipment. I have a feeling, although you've got the George ribbon printed on the side, so you've got two options. Some people are saying that this might have come from the parade, Victory Day parade, or it's come from, my guess is that it might well have come from Azerbaijan. Most likely one of the Victory Day parades, Moscow or otherwise. So it might have come from Moscow or somewhere else. Either way, you're fairly desperate if you're having to get your victory pieces down. I mean, they do look fairly well painted, but some of them might also be coming from Azerbaijan, where they brought the peacekeeping mission out of the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, almost certainly because they need the troops and they need the equipment. So again, it's a reflection that things aren't particularly well if you're having to get to bring in that kind of equipment to the war. Right, that's a long one for me. Sorry about that. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.